Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dennis Sharp. It's my privilege tonight to introduce a lecture which indeed was planned for the AA, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago, but actually takes place now in 1999. Unfortunately and sadly, after the death of Erik Asmussen, Asmussen, last year. Indeed, it was our intention at one time to try and bring Abby over to talk to the AA about his ideas and the principles that underline his work. And indeed, we had his co-partner, who will be spoken of tonight with great admiration, Yarna Klingborg, who with Abby Asmussen initiated, set up, produced, and orchestrated this remarkable development on the site at Järna, which is known as the Rudolf Steiner Seminariat. We're privileged tonight to have the author of, and the biographer of Asmussen, the author of, both authors of the book, which is in front of you at the moment, Erik Asmussen, architect, and they will try and tell us the story of the way this community was set up. It's intriguing because it is a self-sustaining community, if not sufficiently descriptive of being a self-sufficient community, which is based on the organic principles of Rudolf Steiner, and it is one of those magical places. It lies on the side of the Baltic, a contemplative place, a spiritual place, a place with an excess of architecture, an excess of architectural forms, which, when planted into this incredible landscape south of Stockholm, provides a kind of entree into a totally different world. It's a world to do with, as I suggested, sustainability on the one hand, but also to do with healing and with the spirit of man. The healing side is exemplified in the hospital that is run on herbal principles, a revolutionary process in the welfare state of Sweden. And again, I think this is something that the lecturers will touch upon tonight. Anyhow, not to steal their thunder, Erik Asmussen was also my friend, and I knew him for many, many years. He was a wonderful individual. We miss him dearly. And tonight, Gary Coates, who is Professor of Architecture at Kansas State, and as I've just suggested, both the author and the biographer of the book on Asmussen, which won a prestigious award in Sweden when it was first published. And his wife, Susanne Siepl-Coates, who acted as the photographer of the drawings. And the drawings, not the photography, the drawings, and produced a joint publication. I'll hand over to them. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and it is indeed a pleasure to be with you here tonight to share with you some, perhaps, insights into Asmussen's architecture in this remarkable community in Järna, Sweden. In many ways, Dennis Sharp is a kind of godfather of this project that led to the research and eventually to this publication. And we're also pleased to have Professor Jeffrey Cook in the audience, who also served a similar role, so quite fortuitously he's showed up coincident with our visit here from Arizona State University, so we're delighted with that. I would like to just outline for you this, what our presentation will involve this evening, and then Susanna will begin. We will focus on this community that Dennis has alluded to in Järna and try to give you a picture of what that place is like altogether, just as our book, the cover which is on this slide, did focus on that particular concentration of his works. After we've done an introductory tour of the major buildings in that community, and there's more than 20 buildings that Asmussen designed in this community in which he both lived and worked. We will then focus on two major themes that out of the 7 themes or principles that are identified in our research that we think, at least for a first introduction, account for the unique and remarkable qualities of his architecture. We'll focus on harmony with nature and sight, or the way in which the outer context of his architecture helps to determine form, siting, building design, color, all things. And then the second principle, the unity of form and function, the way in which the inner needs of the activities that go on in a place help from the inside out, so to speak, to form its qualities. It's the intersection of these two vectors of force, you might say, that Asmussen worked to shape a very unique architecture. We'll begin then with Susanne.
Could you dim the lights? Yes, thank you. Do you want to show? We first became acquainted with Erik Asmussen's architecture in the mid-'80s, when we quite coincidentally arrived. Maybe we should talk about the place, actually. I don't think we've pointed to it. There's Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, and Järna is just about 50 kilometers south of Stockholm, and as Dennis pointed out, it's right on the Baltic. It's a very beautiful setting, and originated in a park-like landscape as well as in an agricultural surroundings, and you will see that in the slides that will follow. Anyway, we encountered the architecture quite coincidentally when we drove along the road and discovered this particular building with very unusual appearance. It awakened our curiosity by its form as well as its color, and the fact that it sat there as sort of this monument in a way in the landscape, but not at a monumental scale at all. It was rather small in a way. We learned later that this building, along with about 20 others in this area, had been designed by the same architect, Erik Asmussen.
This, by the way, was a mill and bakery, part of a mill bakery complex. Very high-tech building.
Erik Asmussen was born in 1913 in Copenhagen, Denmark. He received his professional education at the Copenhagen Technical College. After attending the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen and practicing in the office of the renowned modernist and functionalist architect Kai Fisker, Asmussen moved to Stockholm in 1939, just before World War II. He continued to live in Sweden until his death at the end of August last year. Shortly after arriving in Stockholm, Asmussen began to work for the architect Niels Tesch, a modern architect who relied upon the vernacular traditions of Sweden as well as the principles of modernism as an inspiration for his designs. In 1960, at the age of 47, and after about 20 years with Tesch, Asmussen began his own independent practice with the design of the Christopher School, a large educational facility in Stockholm. And this was also his first work for an anthroposophic initiative. His work for the anthroposophic community in Yarna itself started in 1967. Roughly 10 years later, in 1976, Asmussen moved his practice from Stockholm to Järna, setting up office on the top 2 floors of a former barn. His staff remained quite small throughout the years, with about 4 to 5 people working with him on a regular basis, and others joining for specific periods of time, depending on the size of the projects on which the office was working. Asmussen was the recipient of numerous design awards, including the Caspar Sahlin Prize, the highest honor given by the Swedish Society of Architects, the Prince Eugene Award, given by the King of Sweden as the highest award that can be bestowed upon an individual artist in Sweden, and the Henrik Steffen Prize, awarded by the FVS Foundation in Hamburg, Germany, to individuals from the Nordic countries who have accomplished works of special significance in the arts, architecture, landscape design, city planning, anthropology, or the humanities. And Asmussen was the first architect to be so recognized since the creation of this honor in the 30s. I think At the time that Asmussen began his own practice in 1960, he had become involved with anthroposophy, which was founded by the Austrian scholar, scientist, artist, and clairvoyant Rudolf Steiner, who lived from 1861 to 1925. The word anthroposophy is a composite created of the words anthropos, or human, and sophia, meaning wisdom, suggesting that our human capacities carry the wisdom to transform ourselves and the world. I'll go through these a little quickly. Just give a sense of the landscape around Järna. Anthroposophy embraces a spiritual view of the human being and the cosmos, but its emphasis is on thinking and knowing, not believing. Thus, anthroposophy is not a religion, but rather a body of knowledge covering the whole of life and a spiritual path for the direct attainment of such knowledge. A prolific writer and lecturer, Steiner gave indications about spiritual wisdom covering all aspects of life, including education, agriculture, health, healing, and architecture. The anthroposophic community in Järna is comprised of people, organizations, and initiatives that have been inspired by the ideas and writings of Steiner. The anthroposophic presence in and around Järna began in 1935 with a curative home for children in need of special care. The first home was so successful that soon another one was needed. With 2 successful curative homes, people realized that they needed healthy food to support both the children and their caretakers. So farms in the vicinity were bought in order to produce biodynamically grown vegetables and also dairy products. The children of the staff eventually needed a place to go to school, so a Steiner school was started. In Steiner or Waldorf schools, the curriculum integrates academics with artistic activity to awaken all the students' capacities, including a reverence for beauty. One thing led to another, and over time, the first initiatives developed into this extraordinarily diverse community in which all aspects of life are based on Steiner's ideas. Gary will go more specifically into the particular buildings, but to give an overview, there is, among others, the Rudolf Steiner College, which is a teacher training institution. There are 3 Steiner schools or Waldorf schools in the area, 15 curative homes now for adults and children in need of special care, 6 biodynamic farms, a biodynamic farming college, a housing community of some 80 dwellings, and a wide variety of businesses that produce everything from organically based paints to musical instruments. I think it's your turn.
In this slide, you can see the village-like core of this diverse and dispersed anthroposophical community in Järna. And I'll give you a sort of brief history and visual tour to give you a sense of place about it. And then we'll take a closer look at some of the design principles that underlie the buildings that you'll see now. The building here is called Vita Huset, which means White House. And it is the former estate of Bruno Liliafors. We'll begin our tour with that, just as the Rudolf Steiner Seminariat began with that building, and then eventually grew on this side of the hedge with a cluster of dormitories, gardens and greenhouses, and a farm and market garden. These were the first projects. Actually, that was the very first. And then the college, Rudolf Steiner College, grew into this orchard meadow area, building by building, and we'll look at buildings starting around this circle of buildings in the meadow, and also the Orion School, which is a Waldorf school, and then the hospital. So we have a cluster of several different institutions which, as Susanne has pointed out, are all organizationally, administratively, financially separate, but joined culturally by an agreement to sort of create a way of life together, making visible in life Rudolf Steiner's teachings and ideas. This is Vita Huset. And I'll run rather rapidly through because this is intended to be a visual survey. One thing that you may notice, and one of the first strongest impressions that we had, was the integration of building, natural landscape, and gardens. It's very much an integration of architecture and landscape architecture. This would be from the approach road looking at the Culture House, which is a performing arts center and headquarters for the Swedish Anthroposophical Society. Ormenlanga, which is means long worm. We'll see why perhaps later in a future image. It is interesting that all of the buildings have names. I think they also have personalities. I know they have histories, and everyone who lives there is quite familiar with them. It was quite remarkable to find a group of people so conversant with architecture and willing to sit down and debate the strengths and weaknesses of any particular building. This is Ormenlanga again. It has public buildings on the end and dorm rooms in the middle portion. This is Robygge, which is the social center and has 2 rooms. I'm having trouble pushing my button here. 2 rooms for eurythmy, which is a form of body movement, a very disciplined form of body movement that Rudolf Steiner created to make speech and tone visible, and which has developed into 2 directions, 2 paths. One, a performance-oriented artistic eurythmy, and the other, a curative eurythmy used in the healing regimens at the hospital and clinic. This building will go into more detail. Again, it has a dining hall, a store for products that are sold by the different manufacturing centers in Järna and elsewhere, kitchen, administrative spaces. Oops. Throughout the landscape, which is a kind of cultivated nature, one finds sculpture, some more fixed than others, constantly changing as the students involved in the fine arts line develop tasks whereby they, in fact, make and place sculptures in the landscape. This is the library building, the library being in the large central portion. One of the characteristics of all of the buildings, this is a dormitory, in fact, where Erik Asmussen and his wife lived. This is the hospital. One of the characteristics of all the buildings at the Rudolf Steiner Seminariat is that each building includes a residential component at the ground level and public space at the upper level. The desire to integrate, make a 24-hour campus in effect, and to integrate living and working in this way. This is the Orion School, K through 12 Waldorf School, the first one of now 3 in the Yarna area. This is a housing village, one of the last projects Asmussen participated in his firm. More of that housing village at the edge of the forest and the fields. This is actually his first project in Järna. It's the gardener's house at Nibla Garden, which is the hand market garden, and was actually the first initiative to be started. Again, there was a desire to mix different use types, business, the organic farms, the market garden, the school, the college, people of all age groups. To an American, this was quite a striking experience to see a human being in a field. It might have been the first that we'd actually seen, not in a tractor, an air-conditioned tractor, that 65-foot wide harvester or something. This is the market garden, but also there's an association between the Rudolf Steiner Seminariat College and a nearby biodynamic college, and then they share common year courses, but one can specialize and study biodynamic agriculture So there's a lot of student apprentices and a lot of involvement by students altogether in agricultural activity. Asmussen designed the light stanchions to light the paths as well as the buildings. Many, many gardens, some, according to Arne Klingborg, 85 to 100 thematically specific gardens. This is a water garden. There are shadow gardens. There are butterfly and bee gardens. This is actually a garden that's part of the waste treatment system, which involves 7 ponds and, as we'll see, flow forms you saw on an earlier slide, designed by the sculptor A. John Wilkes, for, in effect, making ecosystems to digest human waste for the center. So they convert that into garden landscapes, and this is part of that complex. Everywhere you see the mark of human attention and presence, and I think that radiates back to you when a landscape is cared for, loved and cared for over a long period of time. This was a project that was that grew out of an architecture conference, as I recall the story. Was a project that conference participants over a week or two actually chose the project, chose the place, made it, executed it, and placed it. There are innumerable such places that have been created in this way in this process. Some, again, changing and some fixed. This would be related to the art line, the sculpture line. And we're seeing here in the background, this blue building is for eurythmy practice and a painting studio, and the ground level, an apartment and student housing, faculty apartment and then student housing. This is a bench designed by Arne Klingborg, the director and founder and impresario of this remarkable center in Yarna, the great, the person who inspired people to take their different initiatives and to knit together this larger vision of community. Flow forms and the waste treatment ponds, again, recycling water in these ponds, ecosystems in effect designed for different stages of the waste digestion recycling process. These are quite remarkable things. How many, I don't know, has anyone ever seen or heard, or other than Dennis, that's not fair, these places? Dick, you've been there. They were designed by Wilkes to be vessels which would give, as the counterforms of the inner spirit of and the behavioral preferences of water, if you will. What would water want to do? It wants to move in a circle, it wants to move rhythmically, etc. And these vessels, water moves rhythmically like a pulse. It's almost like a living creature, just to stand near them. Very hypnotic, very calming, like ocean waves. They actually have such things that are used for curative purposes for autistic children and others. Here, they're a waste treatment plant. A Lusthaus by one of the ponds by the Baltic Sea. And again, still another image of the pond and the sculpture, some of the sculpture studios woven into the forest as well. And then the ubiquitous gardens. And wild patches of nature, left wild and woven into a fabric so that both wild and domesticated gardens are unified, gardens for pleasure, gardens for use, wild and domestic. I believe this is the Monet garden, or the Blue garden. The other was the Monet garden, sorry. Remarkable architecture everywhere. Again, the pond. And sculptures. Many people feel, as Dennis pointed out, that this community is an example of a way to live more harmoniously on the land in a partnership with nature, using design strategies used with nature to take care of human needs and necessities. Certainly that's the case with the biodynamic farms, the bakery, these kinds of things. But when we also look at the form principles that have guided Asmussen in his architectural design, we also find that that is one of the central themes, one of the 7 themes, as I've mentioned, that are identified through our research. This theme of the harmony with nature and site is an all-pervasive one. Asmussen's buildings are clearly, as you've seen through these images so far, are clearly sculptural forms, even in cases somewhat self-contained sculptural forms, standing rather unapologetically in the landscape, separate from the surroundings in a certain way, not like, for example, Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings, in which the architectural terraces and projections of the building architecturalize, geometricize, and then merge with the landscape, sort of knitting it together. It's not that approach to building site relationships, and yet there is a very considered and consistent approach to building site relationships that grows out of indications given by Rudolf Steiner, and that I think also reflects cultural tendencies in Swedish architecture. His buildings are always engaged in a dialogue with the sites. So when I say harmony, it's exactly what I mean. 2 different notes. There's nature, there's culture, they're separate, and yet they harmonize, speak to one another, and engage in a kind of dialectical play. And that was Abi's conception of the building's relationship to the site. So they form spaces. His buildings form spaces with naturally occurring elements, and they also reflect specific qualities of the natural landscape. And so I'll go through, and Susanne will join me in this segment too, in pointing out examples where these 2 approaches to making a relationship between the buildings and nature and the site works. We'll look first at these 3 dormitories, which are among the first buildings. This was actually the first building built for the Rudolf Steiner seminar itself in 1967. It's Talavana. This is the gardener's house that we saw an image of earlier, and the greenhouses we saw images of in a barn. That complex actually preceded Talavana. These buildings came progressively later. They're clustered on a hillside here, and what I'll be doing is taking a look at this first building, Talavana. This is the site-section relationship. Talavana is this one. There is an agricultural field that we saw an image of earlier that goes towards the Baltic Sea. And as you can see, a very different disposition behind the building in terms of its closeness to this rather steep hillside. This is another dormitory up here in that complex. Anapestin is its name. And when Asmussen first began designing for this community, they were requested and required by the local commune to put together a master plan. The dilemma was, of course, they didn't know if the college would grow, they didn't know what initiatives would proceed. You might say there wasn't a programmatic direction for it, there was just a dream and a vision, but they had to have a master plan that might cover all possibilities. And as they were developing the master plan, they made some decisions early on about what were the basic sites. If one was going to build in this landscape, there were some natural sites, some places that should be left alone, some places where building would be appropriate and would harmonize. And so on that basis, they began locating buildings according to the natural disposition of places. The first building, while they were simultaneously doing this master plan, was Talavana, and they decided, you might say, on an architectural language, that there would be as I've mentioned, the buildings would include both domestic, residential, and public or shared communal spaces. There would be a low portion that mirrors the landscape's horizontality. There would be a more sculptural portion for the public spaces that would mirror the landscape's granite and nice rock outcroppings on which essentially wild patches of nature that were not cultivated. And in that way, the buildings would all in some way echo the structure of the landscape homologously. And so those decisions were made, and as we'll see in Talavana, we'll see how that pattern manifests in other buildings, but we'll certainly see that in Talavana. What I want to concentrate on is this building, Talavana, and in many ways it's a test case for this notion of harmony of building and site, because when one first looks at this plan and this building, it seems pretty much indifferent to its setting. It stands there quite apart from the landscape, as I've mentioned in terms of Frank Lloyd Wright's approach. And yet, we begin to notice some things the closer that we look, and it becomes very interesting, I believe, to do so. We'll pay attention to this corner, which is sort of bent and inflected. We'll look at the difference between this side of the building and this side of the building as they relate, these two elevations, well, actually all four elevations, as they relate to different qualities in the surrounding environment, and we'll see the building in a dialogue, both space-making and in terms of its own form, reflecting those qualities in the environment. I'm going to take a walk now along this path towards this building, towards that inflected edge. You can see again the way in which here gardens for use are woven together with pathways for people, characteristic of this community. And we come upon the building. We see its east-facing facade at an oblique angle, and we come up to this portion of the building, and I think it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to see this facade, as indeed it's intended to be by the etymology of the word, as a face with a kind of eye peeking out the roof, which on the other side, where the path doesn't have this relationship, continues straight across and follows a kind of architectonic logic. In this case, there's a window that serves as a kind of eye, a doorway that one might mistake as a mouth, but certainly there's a facial gesture approaching, speaking to the path of approach. And the building inflecting, in other words, the path literally pushes into the mass there and bends around it. This relationship, again, is a fairly typical one. On this side of the building, the west side, the building in its configuration, in its geometry, mirrors the landscape that one finds over here, and itself stitches together, you might say, with that landscape to create a space that is made in part of nature and part of the building. On the other side, facing the Baltic, in which there are very orderly agricultural fields, as we saw in an earlier image, the building is more vertical, more regular, perhaps even echoing the furrowed, the pattern of furrowed rows of vegetables. We can see, again, here is the western portion and the eastern portion. The western portion, the other side, has stucco, and even here the rhythm of regular vertical lines is reinforced by a choice of rough sawn timber. And then the two elevations drawings that Susanne made for the book that I think reveal the very more random quality, the way in which boulders, rocks, trees, shrubs, etc. on the sloping hillside are clustered, and then the character of this facade, again, echoing the landscape toward which it points. In other buildings, clearly they speak to a very specific spot in the landscape. This is a building called Almandinen, which is, the public function of which is a music room, the private function of which in this plan, as we see the first level, again are housing units. And in this plan one can see the naturally occurring rocks here and here, and the building literally completes that circle of rocks to create a private backyard garden and a front entry space off of the main path. And there are a lot of things going on with any given building of Asmussen's. We're just focusing on building landscape relationships now and not other dialectical plays of, you know, polygon geometries and circular geometries, curves and straight angles and other things that are happening in this. But one, I think, also can see that there is a certain form relationship with that domical, almost head-like element in its placement in that landscape. One senses the building arising out of that conversation in a sympathy with the rocks which it completes.
We see here the site plan of Vidar Clinic, of the Vidar Clinic, and as was mentioned earlier, the kind of medicine that is practiced here is a little bit different than in a regular hospital. It's clearly anthroposophically oriented and uses many herbs in the treatments, as well as massage and art therapy, eurythmy, music, and so forth. To me, perhaps this is the most interesting building of them all, perhaps maybe the most sophisticated designed by Asmussen in this place, because it exemplifies the overall character that this community had, at least on me, which is that of, as was again mentioned earlier, of contemplation, spiritual quality, and again this notion of healing not only at the physical level but also at the spiritual level. The hospital was designed over a period of 20 years, or programmed over a period of 20 years with an exploration of how a hospital would have to be, what it would have to look like in order to have healing quality. So we have a place here that is not just a container for illnesses, for people, numbers, and then the treatments of those numbers that have different illnesses, but rather it's really very focused on the human being and on the aspects of physical and spiritual, mental, emotional health. Architecturally, the hospital complex is expressed in a cluster of 3 different buildings, which are sensitively laid out to complement the existing topography. And the main building, of course, is here, the hospital itself. And we see that there is a rock outcropping, major rock outcroppings along the edge here that the hospital in a certain way relates to. It is, the hospital itself is the largest of the 3 buildings, but there is also a housing unit for staff, which is here, as well as an outpatient facility and a hotel, a patient hotel, where relatives can stay for a period of time, people that accompany the patients. Let's see. We see an aerial view of this situation here. Again, at the larger level, the notion of how the hospital relates to the rock outcroppings that are wooded, and so it's a kind of a wild landscape that grows out of a cultivated landscape surrounding it. And then, of course, the housing cluster here, as well as the outpatient facility. what, again, is fascinating in this situation, comes back to the issues that Gary has already talked about, is that the buildings themselves tend to create space, and perhaps that becomes quite clear here, that the hospital itself creates this courtyard space. Then the housing is arranged in such a way that it creates a space. But again, housing and hospital, an outpatient facility create a space, and these spaces are somehow related to naturally occurring situations such as the big rock outcropping, but also other rocks that sit around the landscape, such as here, for example, a major rock outcropping, and then smaller rocks that relate to the buildings with fences running into them and creating more private spaces, which we don't really see here, but we have a better view here of how even some individual rocks are responded to by moving the building back. So the rock wasn't taken away, wasn't taken out of the site completely, but is taken advantage of in a way, and it creates a special place. In contrast to this environment back here, which gets dark and rather tight, and I will show that in just a minute in the slides, the other side of the hospital, down here, again opens to the Baltic, and there are spectacular views across agricultural fields toward the water. So here we are high up on the rock outcroppings, looking down toward what I consider the back of the hospital, this very intimate and wild space. And we can get a sense that the courtyard opens up into this landscape. So when one is in the courtyard, there is an invitation to go through these openings and out, and to leave the hospital environment. And patients are typically encouraged to do so. Perhaps similar to the situation that Gary spoke about for Talavana, there's a similar situation here at the back of the hospital, is related to the hill of the rock outcroppings, the forested quality, a rock right next to the building, and then the other side being very flat and open. Of course, also the shape of the roof, the angle and the shape are directly related to the site, in the sense that this lower angle here allows much more sunlight to get back there, and then if it were not the case, and also then the skylight, of course, captures the sun that comes from the west and brings it into one of the day rooms, at least on the top floor. So here is a path. Again, the path relates to the wildness of the situation. It is not manicured in quite the same way as some of the other paths, particularly on the other side. And the invitation, not only on the ground floor to get out, but even from the upper level of the gallery, which you will see later, into wild nature. This particular situation shows the day rooms in this part of the hospital with barn door type windows that open almost all the way, giving patients who are not in a position to leave the patient wing the opportunity to either sit in a wheelchair or in one of the chairs in the day room, or even perhaps in a bed, to be close to nature, to have a sense of sunlight and the environment. And again, here we have one of the rocks very close to a day room, so it gives patients a direct invitation to pull out a chair and to sit there, create a small place that can be very private and not institutional at all. I think this is the rock that I showed earlier in the site plan, where the building retreats and makes a space and says the rock was here first. And a sense of the much more, more expansive quality on the eastern side, with many windows out toward the Baltic, much more open, less dense. Small pond that also serves as the water reservoir for potential fires, and the dining room windows that you see there that have that expansive open view toward the east.
The last, or second and last principle we'll look at is the unity of form and function. And in many ways, this you might think of as a meta-principle, the underlying principle of all decisions. Very much growing out of Rudolf Steiner's indications, but also completely coincident with the training that Asmussen received at the beginning of functionalism in Denmark, his association with Kai Fisker, Niels Tesch, and many of the young architects of the distinctive form of functionalism that grew up in the Scandinavian countries. Asmussen, in other words, was very sympathetic already, years, decades before he discovered Rudolf Steiner's ideas, to the principles that Steiner enunciated and carried forward in his more organically expressive architecture. Steiner talked about it, the metaphors that Steiner used, that Asmussen liked to think about and refer to in terms of his approach. Well, one, he said that the building should have a relationship to that which goes on inside of it, as the shell of the nut has in a relationship to the nut itself. The one forms is the counterform of the other. One can hardly distinguish. Once one knows the nut, then the shell has to be as it is. There ought to be this kind of unity of the inner quality of the building and the building. And another metaphor, another occasion, he talked about in a similar way. He said it's like the mold of a jelly mold and the jelly. In Steiner's vision, and actually in the vision of many of the so-called Tradifunkers, traditional functionalists, traditional/functionalists of the Nordic persuasion, who very early on broke with the stylistic formalisms of the functionalists of the continent. Architects like Gunnar Asplund and, of course, the great Alvar Aalto spoke as early as 1935 in similar ways to say that functionalism, which stops short of addressing all the functions, needs, purposes, circumstances of a building, and locks itself into a stylistic image of functionalism, a kind of visual metaphor for a certain kind of idea of functionalism, is a betrayal of modern architecture and of the functionalist impulse. Asmussen always liked to think of himself as a functionalist. He did that with a bit of a wink in his eye and a smile on his face. But he, along with Steiner, saw that there were technological functions having to do with building structure and tectonics. There are psychological functions in any building circumstance that have to be addressed. There are social functions, there are ecological functions, and most importantly, and that which drove all of Asmussen's concerns, there are spiritual and cultural and symbolic functions. Different buildings maybe are located with greater or lesser emphasis on this continuum of functions. There is a difference in that sense between a cathedral and a tool shed, and yet never is any building truly without a whole spectrum of functions. So that was the approach that Asmussen took, and was very much inspired by Steiner's 17 buildings that Steiner designed, and by Steiner's lectures and writings on this subject. By living into the life of the building, by extensive interaction with client and site, and Susanne has mentioned 20 years of programming for the clinic, meeting with, on a monthly basis, with doctors, art therapists, and all the rest, to come up with explorations of how form, space, color, material, etc. could promote healing in a building. Extensive familiarity with site. He lived in the community, which you're seeing images of here, intimately familiar with the users in the community, a member of that community, using the buildings he designed, living in the buildings he designed, and very familiar with the site. His best work was done in Yarna because he was so intimately familiar with the whole context. So by living into the life the building is to contain extensive interaction with client and site, designing also largely with models, ratcheting up in scale, interior models, exterior models, all the way up to one-to-one mock-ups, as he did, for example, in the hospital, mocking up patient rooms and window proportions and placements to make sure that the horizontal patient, as the horizontal man, as Alto referred to it for Paimio, could see out the windows and could have interesting relationships, spatial relationships from the horizontal position. Through all of these means, and by living into the forms and processes of the natural world, guided by Steiner's indications and Goethe's indications and studies of organic nature, Asmussen then was able to create, and certainly intended to create, designs that both image and practically support the life that they were to contain. So there's a twofold function, not only to practically support them, but to image the inner spiritual qualities socially, psychologically, etc. So that theme runs through everything, and we'll just highlight the pervasiveness of this approach. We're looking now at a door handle shaped as the counterform of the human palm, very sensuously. The palm is drawn to this kind of a handle. It feels good to touch it. One knows that one would push this handle. The handles for pulling similarly speak to the body. There's even a difference in this airlock between this exterior door and an interior door in which it's a less fully developed handle of the same variety. But even where one touches the building, it speaks to the hand. There are shop drawings one-to-one for all of these things. They're worked out again as counterforms, literally, of the human touch. Steiner's metaphor here is very literal, perhaps. There are other ways, perhaps more abstract and more symbolic, more visual than these door handle examples. And I just give the examples of the chimneys and fireplaces, which form a kind of family, you might say, of such elements. And Steiner himself designed a power plant and heating unit in which he tried to give an idea about what he was talking about in his own design work. What Asmussen has done is said that even an element like a chimney, one has a function. The function is rather simplified, of course. It's not as complex as a hospital or a performing arts center, but there is a function to be represented as well as practically housed. And in this image of the patient hotel of the hospital, actually it's also the main power plant for the complex. It's a district heating system, which is primarily powered by a water-to-water, deep earth water-to-water heat pump, and backed up with an oil boiler. So this chimney represents the primary heating plant of the complex. But one sees the upward rising gesture of smoke and steam, and then as the hot air and condensing gases and smoke perhaps that would be rising out of that chimney, one has a flare where it's opening up to express that kind of gesture of expansion. So it's gathering, rising, expanding, and releasing. And there are many variations on this. The dormitory Ormenlange. Another example of expressive functionalism is in Robige, the main dining hall, in this sculptural chimney, not unlike many traditional sculptural chimneys in Sweden, but here expressed in such a way that, and even with a bit of humor, since the north is to the right, where the prevailing winter storm winds go, one sees the rising of that smoke and heat being perhaps blown by the northern winds, as that rising gesture is given expression on that wall. This is the room for eurythmy, one of the several eurythmy practice rooms, the main one in that blue building that we looked at earlier. Eurythmy is a very disciplined form of body movement, and like all forms of body movement, it's very important for the dancers to be able to locate the center of the room, to know where they are, how many turns and rotations they've made. So the walls have to be different from each other. If they were identical, you wouldn't know where you were and couldn't keep track of your own rotational movements. And so in this sense, Asmussen developed a plan which is roughly, not exactly, but roughly square, with chamfered edges and plan, as we see in this image. One could imagine the plan here. But in section, you'll notice, and I have a diagram coming, the volume of the space actually gets larger as one goes up along the vertical axis of the spine. And in many ways, that space itself is the counterform, or the volume understood as the counterform of the movement space of the upright dancer. That which gives more realms of freedom, and the trunk and legs, of course, which has a different relationship. So the room itself is a kind of reflection of the nature of the activity, has a gives a very strong sense. It's a very striking room to be in. It gives a very strong sense. One almost wants to move when you go in there. It's hard to resist the temptation. It's such a strong sensation. And because there are not even any shadows, shadows have a hard time finding a place to hide in this building. Light bounces around, and there is this feeling of movement in that space altogether. Other details like the lights, which are made of wood rods at the top and fabric that hangs down, again echo that form of the building. Asmussen designed probably a couple of dozen at least different light elements specifically for particular buildings and rooms and spaces, so that those light elements would reflect the qualities, the inner spirit, practical functions of those rooms. Again, this is the eurythmy. I've just mentioned that's the floor plan. And one sees on the outside something of that same form gesture, so one gets a hint of what's going on inside. The large east-facing window clearly tells you where north, south, east, west is located, so each facade in the interior elevation is different, so the dancers can locate themselves. Give some further examples here from the hospital.
Yes, so I will take you back to the hospital to perhaps illustrate in some more detail the effect that the 20 years of programming had on the actual physical structure of the hospital. We are here in the sculpture therapy room and looking at the windows in that room, which make visible a sense of structure and support the notion that there is an element that is vertical, that supports a more horizontal piece. It's in a way, a very architectural expression of a window. Sculpting is an active process, and the room, therefore, is painted in a warm rose, which unfortunately doesn't really show so very well in this particular image because the room is rather dark. We're moving into the painting room, and the walls here, by contrast, are a pale, neutral, gray, violet, blue. The window in the painting room is vertical in proportion and rises higher than the plane of the ceiling, which contributes to its role in connecting this space to the realm of cloud and sky. And also, of course, allows for more light to come into the room to support the activity of painting. The painting room is much more calm. Oops, that means we need a new tray, yes. The painting room is much more calm and serene in its quality compared to the sculpture therapy space. Not so angular and muscular. One can sense the difference in mood and function immediately upon entering each space, because everything from the light fixtures to the colors, room shapes, and window proportions has been explicitly designed to image and accommodate what goes on in this particular space. We're looking here at let's see, focus. At one of the patient wings, portion of the hospital. At the clinic, the overall building layout and the layout of individual spaces have the character of protecting shelter to support patients during the course of their illness. When patients first enter the clinic, they probably experience a turning inward of the life energies and a desire for isolation. In response to this condition of the soul, each patient room is designed as a world in itself, a world as safe and full of ease as possible. And we can see that to some degree in the thick walls that are the exterior walls of the building. And I will show that in some slides in a moment. It's noticeable in this plan view that some of the patient rooms have rectangular plans, but there are also some irregular pentagonal geometries here. Rectangular rooms can easily have a lifeless character of boxiness, particularly in case of frequent repetition, evoking a life-sapping sense of storage. But they work very well for people who have lost their inner bearings, because the spatial character of such a room tends to be firm and balanced. And I don't know how familiar some of you are with Steiner's architecture, but certainly the cutting off of angles is seen often as a very typical characteristic. And I know that some architects who've worked in this tradition work with that rather liberally. And what I find fascinating in Asmussen's work is that he does that. He sometimes cuts off angles, but he also uses what we consider maybe more typical geometries. And you see a nice balance between the two. And again, it's not just playing with forms or shapes here, but it rather has medical, or let's say therapeutic reasons. The rooms that are based on pentagonal geometries tend to be more life-filled, and they often have a higher sense of containment, which comes from the fact that you enter a space and you don't have a wall directly opposite facing you, but rather an angle wider than 90 degrees. So it's much more welcoming and containing, at least potentially, not as confronting. On the upper level, rooms are articulated by shaped ceiling planes, which further increases the sense of containment and shelter. Shaped ceilings also provide visual and spatial interest for patients as they lie looking upward from their bed, and there are some patients who are in bed for long periods of time. And Asmussen has been quite aware of that. An image of a patient room where, again, color is applied, but it is not only soothing and providing comfort to the patient. The choice of color in the patient rooms is one of the more obvious examples in which the building contributes directly to the healing of the patients. Some of the patient rooms are painted in cool blue-violet tones, while others are shaded toward the warm rose hues. Anthroposophic medicine distinguishes between two main types of illnesses: the feverish and inflammatory types, or warm illnesses, such as rheumatoid arthritis, and the degenerative or sclerotic ones, or cold illnesses, such as arteriosclerosis. Depending on the type of illness, doctors often prescribe either warm or cool-colored rooms for their patients. At the Vidar Clinic, as in all the other buildings, color is never used for merely symbolic or decorative purposes. Rather, it is intended to serve the process of healing by affecting primarily the soul body, soul condition, and to support the function of the spaces in which it is applied. Occasionally, exterior walls bend outward, creating asymmetrical window bays and alcoves that bring light into the room from two sides. Windows are operable and have deep and shaped reveals. They are designed with great care to allow views from each bed location. The deep sills offer a place for plants and other personal items that the patients might want to bring. The main entrance to the clinic is manifested as a small volume extending out from the larger building volume, at what initially, at least, appears to be a right angle. And really, it took me a very, very long time visiting the hospital over and over and not noticing that this volume of the main entrance is ever so slightly turned toward people who are arriving from here. And so it actually has an almost imperceptible greeting quality. It says hello. Upon arrival at the hospital, one enters the foyer. There's no signage, very little signage, and it already communicates very much the fact that the notion of an institution is avoided here, very different from other hospitals that you may have experienced. So it is not exactly a home-like environment either. It's something very much, very close to that, but not really that either. And I think it is just a piece of art, this kind of subtlety with which Asmussen has avoided the clinical, technological feeling of a hospital without becoming sort of the opposite, which in America at least, it might become a Disney world of home-like environments. Entering the foyer, one immediately has a view of the outside into the centrally located courtyard through large door-sized windows, which has the effect of reducing anxiety, and of course it makes orientation very possible. The colors here, rose-colored marble, green and yellow walls, as well as the green plants, have a soothing and, again, protecting quality. Corridors in most hospitals are straight and turn at right angles. At the Vidar Clinic corridors, they're almost straight, but they're not quite straight. They sort of turn in pieces. When there are turns, they are never exactly 90 degrees. They tend to be larger angles, around 105. The corridor, which rings the courtyard, which is this space here, is broken visually into segments by means of subtle changes in direction that arouse a sense of anticipation to see what might be coming next. And you, just a little while ago, saw a plan of that patient wing, which is entered right here in this location. And when you enter the patient wing right there, you cannot actually see the end of the corridor. There's a window there. Only as you walk down and you shift direction ever so slightly, you then begin to see that particular window, which, by the way, gets a light from the other side too to avoid glare. So again, it's very thoughtful. And Asmussen has managed to bring light in from the sides in this part, as well as here, where he opens up the corridor into an alcove-like space that allows patients to sit together with family and friends, to have make a phone call outside of the path of traffic, and so this particular environment becomes very much more than just a corridor, but it becomes a place to sit, to linger, to meet others, and so forth. In the central core, in opposition also to the corridors in the patient wings, which are double-loaded, in the central core, the corridors are single-loaded, with the circulation realm running parallel to the courtyard, so one has always a view out into that space. The upstairs corridor, which you see here, is relatively narrow and has a low-shaped ceiling in some areas, expressing the sense that one is under the roof. So it's clear, again, where one is in relation to the building, provides orientation. If you remember, in the foyer, we had higher ceilings, and the materials there were marble on the floors. Here, the materials have changed. We have soft pine wood floors, and the windows are smaller, set deep into the wall. This suggests a more private realm than below. Different view continuing on that same corridor. The gallery completes the corridor on the outside of the building. This two-story space to the west of the courtyard is designed to provide rain and wind-protected sunny outdoor places for patients and others visiting the hospital. Again, ledges and the potential for movable furniture allow each person or group to find the combination of sun, wind, and light that's appropriate for the season and for their condition. By connecting the two patient wings through this gallery, the gallery completes the indoor corridor that circles the courtyard on the east, so that patients have many options to explore the building and to get around, but also offering protected places just to be outside in the sun or to observe activities in the courtyard. And during our many visits to the hospital, we have seen patients in beds who are being moved out, who have the joy then to actually experience sunlight, perhaps some wind, little wind. The most important space in the clinic is the courtyard. It really is the spiritual center of the hospital. Everything happens in and around the courtyard. Children are at play here near the fountain. There are performances that take place, groups, artistic groups traveling through occasionally visit the hospital for a presentation. And of course, during midsummer, staff, nurses, therapists, doctors, and the hospital administrator, as well as patients who are able to do so, get together and create the setting for a celebration that then takes place in the afternoon, and where everybody who is there and willing to can participate. Thus, the courtyard allows the patients to connect with the larger world, either through observation or through participation. You have something?
I will finish just with a couple more examples and then be open if people will have the time for questions and discussion. I'd like to look at another way in which the unity of form and function has guided Asmussen in his design work. This is Robygge, the place with the dining hall, the kitchen, the two eurythmy practice rooms, and an interior courtyard. This is the plan of that building. One enters through the airlock here and comes into this space, the dining down this way, the administrative offices down this way, the store is here, kitchen facilities and dishwashing, and then an apartment for the cook. So if you lose your job there, I guess you lose your house too. Gives you an incentive to cook in a good way. And this building, again, through its form, geometries, proportions, etc., is speaking at a number of different levels. What I'd like to call attention to, however, is just the most simple level of the physical and psychological functions and social functions. This is the south edge. This is the dining hall with that artistically expressive fireplace element here, both the chimney and the interior expressing these qualities of its functions. And you'll notice that the center of that space is shifted to the south so that the low winter sun angles can penetrate. It's the lowest segment of the building to allow the sun into that wind-protected interior courtyard, which is used as much as possible throughout the year. To the north, we see the high-volume eurythmy practice room set on top of other more functional administrative spaces. So the overall composition of the building reflects the play of sun, wind, and light, and climate control, the building's function for providing habitable outdoor space. You can get a sense of that sheltering quality of the building and the way in which this lowest portion is to the south, and also somewhat low to the west and to the east, so light can get in. And then on the interior of the building, the courtyard, the two eurythmy practice rooms, which are linked by a conference meeting room here, provide a setting, a sort of back against which one can sit, as this lady is doing here, finding sunshine. Most typically, one seeks sunshine even in the summer, we've observed. And one looks then towards the south, towards the light. And in doing so, we see some material choices and some color play that, again, reinforce and image the protective functions of this courtyard. Treated here on the north side, the high volume spaces, it is sawn timber, board, and batten, which is the vocabulary that Asmussen uses for the outsides of buildings. This is butt jointed fir, more smoothly finished and painted, in this case, in a gold, orange, yellow color. The thinking here again is that this becomes the exterior of the courtyard. One looks towards an interior room, and there is a color balancing. That is, since the facade that faces the courtyard, you can sort of see it here, that's the dining hall. Very often that will be in shadow. When one looks that direction, one sees the warmth of that color. Even though it's in shadow, it compensates for its shadow condition. You feel the sun on your face, and you see the warmth of the sun in the color. Again, reinforcing the larger formal ideas of the building. And this is the last building we'll look at. It's the last major building Asmussen completed. It is the Culture House. It is housing a large theater for some 500 persons with a large volume, sort of convex swelling shape, horizontal shape for the auditorium, vertical day-lit fly tower, and then around the outer edge will be the foyer and offices for the Swedish Anthroposophical Society. The building is composed, one of the principles that I talk about in the book is polarity, and we can see that very much here also, that we have this convex figural element of the auditorium, and then these concave forms that are outward reaching, embracing, and in the spirit of the harmony of sight and building are actually shaping and completing spaces in relationship to rock outcroppings and to the rest of the circle of the buildings on the south side around the orchard meadow. And this is embracing the agricultural field, which we saw across the long distance there. So the play of convex and concave forms, and what I'll be looking at is the contrast in the final images between the qualities of the foyer and the qualities of the hall, between spaces designed for movement, activity, impromptu gatherings, social occasions, etc., seen and being seen from above and below and all around, versus the more concentrated and focused activity of the auditorium itself, in which people gather to relate to performances of eurythmy, to lectures, to dramatic performances given at the stage. So we'll see how Asmussen uses form, space, and color to communicate these different inner qualities of and functions. This is the foyer. We're looking towards an area where there is a very sculptural fireplace, similar to Robiga, but again, same pattern, but a different form. This faces out towards the orchard meadow, where the other buildings gather in a circle around that, towards the south. This is an area related to the cafe, dining area, and it's used for banquets, formal and informal gatherings. School children have given performances where they've been inspired by the spaces in the foyer. It has given rise to a great deal of activity. The upper level, again, with similar in its character to the hallways, corridors in the Vidar Clinic, because there are similar functions, trying to invite movement, provide places for socializing, for private contemplation, providing visual interest and all the rest. Here it's even more spatially integrated in the two stories, more opportunities to see and be seen, and to create a denser atmosphere, you might say, of conviviality, appropriate for the foyer function. That must be Scotty. Can beam me up in a moment, and if I don't finish shortly. So I will finish shortly. This is the auditorium itself, with sculpted wood walls, with wood that was grown on an adjoining farm, the Nibla farm, and cured and carved by both students and professional sculptors in the community. before they've gotten the glass windows in this particular image. The painting is done by Arne Klingborg again, and you can see the bas-relief effects, which have both artistic and narrative functions, you might say, related to Steiner's teachings about the spiritual path, as does the ceiling. But of course, there's an acoustical function that happens here. This hall has become rather well known in circles in Europe because of its acoustic qualities. People now come here to produce their CDs, and one does not need an amplification system for either, voice or musical instruments. It's quite live and quite resonant, nicely balanced. And one sees this image with the carved glass windows, borrowing and advancing a technique first pioneered by Steiner for his Goetheanum buildings in Dornach. There are, of course, reasons behind the colors and the stories told in the carved glass windows. But the glass itself creates a mood or an atmosphere in which one is almost literally has the sensation of breathing light. It's a very strong sense by having these single colored windows and then the merging and overlapping of these colors. The idea is to create a more centered, focused, contemplative mood for the performance functions. The idea is that it's not entertainment, that again, when performances are done, they are related to the spiritual disciplines and ideas of Steiner. So there is a particular mood that needs to be sustained in such an environment. And while containing people in that space, it was Steiner's idea, paralleling the ideas of the early modernists, which wanted to dissolve space and open it up to the larger world. Steiner had a similar intention in his work and in the impulse that Asmussen took up, especially in this space, not only in this space, where while one is very much contained and shaped in a concentrically focused room, sheltered and contained, that in the spiritual imagination one is invited to penetrate the walls and the glazing as if one is moving out into spiritual domains of perception, unlimited by the presumed physical limitations. So there, again, one might talk here about a spiritual functionalism. And you can see here in this photo of Susanne the effect of these different colors, the way in which one gets complementary color shadows, and the way in which, given the parallax effects of light entering those windows, you get a shifting pattern of overlap of these different colors. And as you sit in the chairs, you can see these shadows on your own body, and I think all of this contributes to the sense that one is literally breathing colored light. One is in an environment filled with a dynamic and yet subtle play of colored light. And that is all we have to share with you for the moment. And we invite people to ask questions, to enter in discussion. I know many of you have evening engagements and the need to move on as well, and we'd like to encourage you not to feel awkward in leaving if you have to. But thank you very much.
Well, the duo of Gary and Susanne has been most helpful in illuminating a community which has a great sense of connectiveness. It's a pity somehow we didn't have a movie to show you really how you go through those spaces. It's very difficult when you're configuring architectural space through a series of single images. I know movies are made up of single image, but it's really the dynamic of the movement that's behind much of what we've seen, and really has to be, in this context, rather imagined. So there is an architecture of connectivity here, and one obviously that also has a historical precedent of the Steiner impulse. They very kindly opened up a conversation. If you want to ask any questions or you wish to make a contribution, now's the time. Yeah.
Yes, please.
You mentioned for plants that they are somehow related to wastewater.
Yes. Well, that's a story. As I understand right now, they're working rather well. And they worked rather well in their initial design for a certain number of years as the population was in proportional balance to their design. But with increased visitors, there's some 45 to 50,000 people in organized visits to look at these gardens per year. You can imagine a community designed for a few hundred people, what that was producing. The way it works now, and the way in which technically it seems to be satisfactory to all parties, health officials, artistic designers, and landscape designers, is that the wastes are pumped now to a settling pond, which is an anaerobic digestion chamber. And then the effluent from that is moved through a sand filter, and after that sand filter is then moved to one in the sequence of 7 of these rather large ponds. So they make use of size and area and time. That is, we've been told that perhaps a molecule of water might take a year to make its way to the Baltic. As you might imagine in Sweden, they're not without studies, scientific studies of this, and the studies that I'm familiar with have shown that there is in fact potable water produced at the end of the treatment system that goes back into the Baltic. So it is equal to, or they claim superior to, a tertiary treatment plant using chemical methods to treat this. In terms of odor, there were days over the 10 or more years that we visited where there was you'd smell and you say, what is this? And, but other than that, it was virtually invisible. And I think that was a symptom of the overloading problems that in fact were occurring right before they redesigned and re-engineered the system to be able to handle the kinds of volumes of waste that they now encounter. So I would presume that now it is a well-functioning system even in this cold northern climate.
I wonder, you showed that he was also very deeply interested in the interior, but I wondered if he also maybe contributed to the furniture.
Yes.
To that?
That's another book someone could do. Yes, but he did design, let Susanne talk about that too, but most certainly he designed the lamps and many pieces of furniture, chairs and tables, and I don't know if you want to say anything particular about that, but stools, chairs, and some of that now has actually gone into production, manufacture, to make an income stream to help support the work of the community. That was the last thing that Abi said that he was working on after he was to finish his retrospective exhibit at the Royal Swedish Academy of Art. He was going to spend the next year focusing on furniture design for purposes of production. But over the decades, he designed many, many pieces of furniture. And that could be a presentation discussion on its own. Is that a signal or readjustment?
Gary, obviously this is a community of individuals and also gifted people that has developed over a long period. Could you comment at all about the relationship of these ideas in other communities or in other countries? To what degree is this absolutely unique in the world? To what degree does this represent some seeds for the future?
Well, I'll begin to answer that. Maybe, Susanne, you'll have some issues to raise too. But it's a good question because it revolves then around the issue, to what extent is this a model that others might learn from, and to what extent is it a very unique happening that one can simply admire and praise? And that's an important question. Among anthroposophical groups, there may be a number of similar kinds of places. Certainly the colony in Dornach that has the 17 buildings designed by Steiner or 16, one of them burned, and the houses and other buildings that others in that movement have created there. That's the other major concentration, you might say, in terms of an artistic unity of this sort. There are small places in the United States like Spring Valley, New York, where there is a college and there is an elderly person's home and 10 acres of biodynamic gardens and a Waldorf school and this kind of thing that make a kind of collective. There are major centers in Germany and Austria, and it's much more common in German-speaking part of Europe than it is in the United States to find such concentrations. But in all truth, in that movement, there are only two such places that have the kind of critical mass and presence. That's Dornach and Dornach North in Järna. We also have observed that much of the architecture in the anthroposophic movement tends to be imitative and derivative. You know, a kind of Mr. Potato Head architecture. Anyone old enough to know? I give myself away to the younger people. What Mr. Potato Head is? It was a child's game where you had a little plastic head, kind of a neutral head, and then you could put on a different nose and a different ear and stick it together, and it looked like Charlie Chaplin or whatever. You make different faces. And I'm afraid that there are many less than gifted architects who have simply taken form motifs without a great deal of understanding of the generative principles behind Steiner's thinking and made it look anthropopish, and done a lot of very bad buildings that have, I think, tarnished the great creative and generative potential of Steiner's impulse. Asmussen is one of the very few architects in the world. There's a couple of others. I think Billings Peters Ruff and Tone Alberts and some others have really carried that impulse in a creative way. But in terms, I think, of the quality of architecture, there are hardly any other places. In terms of the kind of community that we find, I did an earlier book, as you know, called Resettling America, in which I was looking at these kind of cooperative community themes and the sustainable design themes and the rest. And in many ways, this community fulfilled the range of impulses represented in that book, a spiritual, contemplative community that embodies the whole of life. In the Western world, to my knowledge, I don't know any other functioning living community today that has the scale, diversity, and intensity of this place. It is quite remarkable. As Susanne mentioned, 65 businesses, 15 educational institutions, half a dozen farms, a major mill that supplies bread for all of Sweden. And this is a major center. It's the third largest employer in the commune behind Saab and the government, which in Sweden is a big employer. Those are giants. And so in that sense, one has to look back maybe to 19th century American utopian communities like the Shakers and others to begin to find a center with the range and scope. And yet it's different than those communities because it's not under single management. It is a cooperative association of independent organizations. People who have a passion about the farms, people who have a passion about children with Down syndrome and emotional problems, people who have a passion about this, that, or the other. They form their thing, and as a critical mass is reached, discover this is a good place to gather. The familiar with. And it sort of answers your question. Other comments, questions?
Well, one more.
We can see that the designer put much thought in light. But what about sun energy? How do the buildings perform energetically?
Well, first of all, yes, the buildings, as would be typical, as is typical in Sweden, are very heavily insulated. They're a combination of timber and brick bearing wall construction with, 20 centimeters of insulation, etc. Well insulated, argon-filled wall windows, even with these funny shapes. They're custom made. So the envelope is a pretty tightly sealed or tightly insulated. It's not really tightly sealed because there's more of the European approach to breathing walls. But so they're energy conserving buildings. Then, of course, in Sweden you have the endless summers where it never gets dark very nearly, and the endless winters where it hardly ever gets light. So The strategy there, they've not used a conventional sort of passive solar design strategy of maximizing southern orientation for all buildings. It's a balance between responding to site context and to the sun and other orientation factors. The social center I showed you with the dining room has that large bank of windows facing to the south. The dining room of the hospital faces south, so there are selected rooms throughout the different buildings that are very much a kind of passive solar design with summer sun controls that come out with canvas and that sort of thing. I'd say the primary reason or way in which the buildings respond to energy issues would be coming through the very efficient water-to-water heat pump system that goes down some 70 meters to tap the heat content of the groundwater, and the very efficient Nordic district heating system where they can distribute that heat efficiently. And of course, cooling is a trivial problem from an American, Midwestern American point of view that can be handled with the ventilation, stack and cross ventilation that he provides. So biological materials, yes. Controls on electromagnetic pollution, especially in the hospital for all the patient rooms, all the Baubiologie ideas, linoleum floors, mineral and vegetable-based paints in casein, bases. So all the paints and the materials are non-toxic and healthy, and all of that sort of thing. And as I mentioned, many of the materials are coming either from land owned by anthroposophic organizations in the area, or certainly locally and using local building methods, not advanced high-tech kinds of things, except of course the windows, which are pretty high-tech. But they're still local, they're still Swedish companies.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for attending. Can I just remind you that on Wednesday afternoon at 3:30 here in the Erik University will be talking about another community which has had a struggle, I think, throughout history. This is the Solari community in Arizona, Akasanti, and somebody earlier, I believe, especially the power. So 3:30 on Wednesday. I'm not sure where it is.
Studio A, does that sound right?
Well, I know now the answer to it.
I was searching. Boy!
I should have told you.